Well, good morning, Village. If you're able to find your seat, we'll dive in. It was fun coming in this morning and hearing Brian on the organ, and then also just want to thank Stan and Esther on the piano for leading us in worship this morning. It was wonderful, so thank you for that. I'm a little under the weather, so I've got Doris praying for me right out there outside the doors in the hall. It's nice to know where your prayer people sit every week so that you can find them. But I want to just start by saying Happy Veterans Day. And if you are in the armed services or our military or a branch of service that way, would you just please stand so that we could recognize you? My dad was a career naval officer. He was in the back, so standing as well. But just growing up every 3 years, moving somewhere different, and realizing how many people serve and give their lives so that they can protect the freedoms that we hold dear. And so just want to thank you for all that you do and so much of what gets missed or doesn't get appreciated. A little story. It's hard for me to forget Veterans Day because it happens to be my birthday. So today is my birthday. November 11th is Veterans Day. We call it Veterans Day because that was the ceasefire during World War I, known as Armistice Day. And when I was growing up, we didn't get it off from school. So I, many years in a row, starting in about 7th grade, I think through 9th grade, would always do my English paper on why we should get Veterans Day off from school. And I'll have you know that my youngest goes to Findlay Elementary School, and they got both Friday and this upcoming Monday, tomorrow, off from school. And so I believe somewhere somebody read one of my papers, and I contributed something to the cause. But anyways, thank you, and we honor you. And I want to talk about where we're going, and then this will be a bit of a bridge week as we close down the missions conference series and then transition into something that we're just going to call Be the Church for a few weeks. But just this conviction that we really are the body, that there are many members in it, parts to the body, and that we really get to realize the fullness of what God designed the church to be when each part is doing its work, right? I don't get to realize the fullness of what my body is supposed to do if parts of my body aren't working. I become sick or I get laid up, and I don't get to realize the fullness of my humanity, of my life, of my energy, of the relationships I have, of what I can do in this world and contribute meaningfully. And there's something beautiful about the church when we come together and realize that both with our words in sharing, both with our hands in serving, with our hearts in giving, that we really get to own the church, that it's our church, that we are the church. It's not a building, it's the people. In fact, the word for church that Paul, it was a simple word, ekklesia, a Greek word that just meant gathering. So when Paul was being stoned, it was by an ekklesia. It was a group of people that had gathered. And Paul takes that simple word and he begins to baptize it over time in his letters and gives it this special significance that he's going to take a common word and somehow make it mean something for the spiritual community, to where today church or ekklesia means something really deeply significant to us. And I think we can do that with this idea of collaboration, this idea of ownership, this idea of being the church. So that's coming up. After that, we go into Advent. For Advent this year, we're going to camp in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, and just looking at these prophetic words of Jesus, wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. These things that show up during Christmas in songs, in greeting cards, and really camp on that and say, what does it mean that the Messiah, the promised one, was to reflect these characteristics? So we're excited about that. And then we're coming off of what was a justice series prior to the missions conference, where the purpose of that was really to take and try and find some normative language for something that's deeply central in Scripture. So we're a multi-generational church, multi-ethnic, multicultural church, and so we end up finding ourselves in different communities that use language in different ways. And so justice to one group or to one person might mean something than justice to another group or another person. Jesus, as the one that calls us into justice, might mean something more significantly to one person or a certain group. And what we're trying to do is say that we we can't find justice without Jesus, and that if we find Jesus, Jesus also calls us into justice. And that series was to find common language, that justice and righteousness share a lot of overlap in what they mean, that justice isn't just something we do, but it's one of the ways that we come to know God. And then the third thing was that justice is related to the gospel. Hear me now. Justice is not the gospel, but you can't talk about the good news of Jesus Christ, that God is reconciling all things to himself, without making reference to justice language. When I'm forgiven by Jesus on the cross and therefore I am justified, that's justice language. And so just trying to show how all of these things somehow are connected. I was asked, and it was a fair question, but I was asked by somebody, why did we spend 3 weeks on justice? And it's a fair question, but the answer would simply be that it's a part of the character of God. So if I spent 3 weeks on holiness, or 3 weeks on the love of God, or 3 weeks on the faithfulness of God, I don't think anybody would come and say, why in the world are we talking about God's faithfulness for 3 weeks? So justice was something that we could look at and come together and try and find some common space. But as we transition now, I want to talk a little bit about a week ago when I was able to find myself in visiting Village's missionaries. Village has a history that goes back to 2003 when John Jordan and John Johnson, and you can go ahead and just leave this up. It's a fun picture. I'm going to need more than Doris praying for me this morning. I'm already just I'm really hot. Not in that way. The tenors and all that. But if a couple more of you could be praying for me, that'd be great. But in 2003, we kicked off this engagement. So you've got about 15 years, and now we've got several families that are over there, 8 missionaries, I think, or 6 missionaries that have come from Village and are working in different areas of. And so you've got this long, sustained, deep engagement with. In fact, as I went around, it's amazing that John Jordan is a bit of a rock star there. John Jordan, anywhere you go, everyone seems to know him. So I texted John, it must have woke him up in the middle of the night, and I said, half the people know you. And I think he said something like, absolutely not. It's closer to 40%. But it was fun just to see the fruit of John's ministry there and how well he was received. But as I'm over there, I got to meet with our group and just spend the night at dinner with them. So you have the there and Scott, who's taking the selfie, and so you've got only his glasses in it. And you've got Jordan and Christine, who is here and not there. We did take a picture where we created a space for her. She was there in spirit. And then you've got, and all of them working in different ways, whether it's or with regard to education and teaching. And it's amazing to see the fruit of what they're doing. But as I went from there, it was amazing to hear the stories of how God is working. There are so many stories of Jesus appearing to people in dreams that in multiple places I went, they said, we can't even capture them. They're horrified that someday they're going to look back and say all these stories were coming in and it was impossible for anyone to write them all down. And they started sharing some of these, but stories of a woman with children and just basically a shack refugee woman, and it's coming to winter. And by the way, you can end up with 6 inches of snow and people with nothing but flip-flops walking around and kids. and trying to endure the winter, and the makeshift stoves that they're able to get from some of the aid organizations, what that's like in terms of air quality in these makeshift tents. And this woman was in this and worried about her children and how they were going to make it through the winter, and the husband was away trying to find some money, and she had a dream in which Jesus appeared to her as the one who walks on water and says, as the one who walks on water, I can care for you. And she had never heard of Jesus walking on water. She didn't know Jesus. And her husband comes back from his trip and comes into her and says, I have something to say, something to share. I know things are bleak. He says, I had this person appear to me in a dream and named himself Jesus and introduced himself as the one who walks on water. And you hear these crazy stories that are happening and just miraculous. And I want to show you a little bit of just the refugee situation in the next pictures because it was different than what I thought it was. And the which is where statistically 1.5 million refugees are, but potentially closer to 2 million in the country. Many of them or most of them in what was known as the breadbasket of the Middle East, going back to Roman times. It's the fertile area where everything was grown. I thought refugee camps in Lebanon would be like what you often see in the movies, where it's a gated community where they can monitor who comes in, who leaves, keep the camp safe to some degree with big chain link fences, and house a whole lot of people in one area. And they don't have official refugees. There's just these kind of immediate camps. They don't want to call them refugees because of what that would mean for them staying long term. And so these camps are on private land. So all of the refugees are on private land where they're charged rent. But there's only 3 things that a Syrian refugee, can do to make money. It's agriculture, construction. I forget the third one. Thank you. You must be married to Doris. Thank you, Chuck. So put your mind into it with me. You're coming in with a family. Average family size is upwards of 6, 7. So you have your children, and in Syria before the civil war, it had the highest middle class of any of the countries in the Middle East. And so you're talking about people that many of whom are like you or I, coming into a place where Syria was oppressing, but just a decade or two ago. And so there's a lot of the hatred still from that. And you come in and you have to rent space to put up one of these, and it's simply wood, and you can see they take old signs from billboards and try and cover these, but they don't weather well, and they try and cover these different makeshift sites, and they're exploited. They're exploited for their labor. Their children are exploited for labor. They have a hard time both paying for this and for the food. And it's a pretty crazy situation. And so the helplessness that I feel for one of my children that's having a difficult time or can't figure something out, or something is happening at school, and I feel so helpless that I can't control that. I just was blown away at multiplying that to the nth degree and finding yourself in a situation like this. The average amount of time it takes a refugee once they've fled their country to get back on their feet or established is 17 years, a minimum of 17 years. And so children grow up uneducated, and as a parent, you're watching them grow up and knowing they will always be behind because they weren't able to have the education or the trauma that they're not able to get help for. So it was a blessing to be able to see and to feel what this is like, and to know how our missionaries and so many other organizations and Christians are working with this. Churches, I met a pastor, a church of 100 people, and they found themselves with Syrian Muslim refugees all around the church. And they came together for a meeting and talked about it, and all 100 people said, we should open our doors and welcome these people in. They now have 1,000 in their church. So the church has gone from 100 to 1,100 with 1,000, and all of them economically poor. And the pastor started talking to me about the level of change that brought to their church of 100 people. Can you imagine it? The kids ministry, the worship services, the language, where the resources are going. And it gave me a whole new measurement for what church change really is. We've gone through a lot of change here at Village, but it was amazing how that experience opened up my mind to just how much a church can really endure if they understand that they're called and they're on mission with God. But so the next picture was also fun, going to the biblical town of Sidon. This goes all the way back, an ancient town founded off of the grandson of Noah is the biblical record. This is on the rooftop of one of the oldest churches there, dating back to the 8th century. And we can continue on. I was able to be taken around this city. It ends the Silk Road, or it's one of the port towns on the Silk Road coming all the way from China. This was where silk would be stored, a big crusader town as well during that time period. And we were led through this town by a Muslim cleric, Sheikh Mohammed. So he's the leading Sunni Muslim cleric, or judge, if you will, in this town. He led us through. He had keys to the church going back to the 700s. I thought that was fun that he had keys to the back door of the church and to the rooftop. In this particular church, there was a split back between the Greek Orthodox and the Catholics. And so this historic church going all the way back over 1,000 years, they walled a partition into this historic. It was a long time ago they did this, and they worshipped on other sides of kind of a brick wall in the middle of this. And so it was a little bit of a lesson in church splits. And then lastly, this is the cathedral named after St. Nicholas. And this is a mosaic or a picture inside that represents both Peter and Paul. If you go to the end of the book of Acts, as Paul is being taken and he's imprisoned by the Romans, they stop at Sidon, and the Roman captors allow him to go in and meet his friends. And so church tradition has it that this was the last time that Peter and Paul met or saw each other, that they were able to conference, and they talked about the spread of the gospel as it went to the nations. And you see that Peter's later writings, the letters of Peter, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, etc., are writing to the Christians of the churches that Paul founded. And so this is kind of representing that, and church legend has it that it comes back to this. But as we went through and did this, we started talking, a couple of us on the trip, about something fascinating with regard to the spread of the gospel and the connection of missions and the engagement with everyday people. Because everywhere we walked and interacted with Christian communities, you saw that the meshing together of a kind of love for neighbor with missions. So with David and Carla in the youth center, they're working on reconciliation between different communities that are at odds with each other, different ethnicities that don't talk but fight one another. And as they're doing this reconciliation work, as and works with children there and families there, he's meeting their needs, the vulnerabilities that they have, and doing it in the name of Jesus and meshing these two things together. As the others are teaching people about business as mission or entrepreneurship, they're talking to vulnerable people and trying to give them tools to earn a living and to support their families, but doing it in the name of Christ, and how those two things go together. And so as we talked about it when we were going we looked at a passage of Scripture. So we're going to be in Matthew 25, the whole chapter. And what we're doing today is a little bit different. We can camp on a verse or a paragraph in Scripture and really dive into what it says. But sometimes what we do is we zoom out to understand Scripture. I can zoom in on a person and see a lot about them, But if I zoom out, I begin to realize they're on the shore of a lake and that it's a sunny day. And if I zoom out even further, I realize it's a mountain lake and that there's mountains and that there's still snow on the mountains, and I know what time of year it is. And I get a whole different context than when I just have the zoom in of the person. Does that make sense? So what I want to do is give you the zoomed out picture of some scripture that we're really familiar with, but I would reckon that most of us have heard it in isolation, and it has a totally different effect in isolation than seeing the panorama. So in Matthew chapter 25, we have three parables. Now, parables in biblical interpretation, if we go back one slide, we'll just leave it. Is there one without the be ready? Maybe not. So the punchline's already given. So I'm gonna go back and give you the rationale for the punchline. But in parables, we find that a parable is a story that Jesus gives that has this kind of aha moment or this pivot thing that draws out in a very impactful way one truth. The idea of interpreting parables is to find the one truth. Now, you can look at the edges and learn something about Jesus, learn something about storytelling, learn something about ancient Near East culture. But in terms of Jesus' teaching in parables, there's really one central, dominant kind of aha of why he's telling this story. And so in the parable, the first one in Matthew 25, it's the parable of the 10 virgins. And you basically have half of the virgins are wise ones, and half of them are not. In verse 4, the wise ones took oil in their jars along with their lamps. So they're going to go to sleep. They're all bringing their lamps, and a lamp is what you need when the bridegroom comes, so that when the bridegroom comes, he will connect with you. So they all go and they bring their lamps, but only half of them are smart enough to bring oil with them. And so in the middle of the night, when the bridegroom comes, the ones that don't have oil run to the ones that do and say, "Quick, give us some oil." And the ones that have it say, "We can't, because if we gave it to you, there wouldn't be enough for our lamps. Go to where they sell oil, buy it, and then come back." So the foolish ones leave to go buy the oil, but they're too late in coming back. But the ones who are ready, they have enough oil. They trim their lamps. The lamps go on. So the whole idea of the parable of the virgins in the beginning of Matthew 25 is this idea of being ready for the return of Jesus Christ. That when Christ comes, we're to be ready. Does that make sense? That's the point of this parable. It's not an often taught one, but that's the central tenet. The next parable is the parable of the bags of gold, or it's the parable of the talents, is kind of how we know it. So the parable of the talents, if we leave that up, is that the man going on a journey, he's going away. So you get this motif of somebody going away and then is going to return. But the one going away entrusts money or bags of gold to the servants. Now, listen carefully, it's to each of them as they have abilities. So one bag of gold to somebody that has the ability for one bag of gold, 5 bags of gold, etc., to the one that has a lot of ability. And they go and take this money and do what they're going to do with it. Now, when the man comes back, he comes back and he looks to settle accounts is the phrase in this parable. And the different people come to him, and the one that had 5 bags of gold brings them. This is in Matthew 25, starting in verse 14, going all the way to verse 30. But the one that has 5 bags of gold comes and brings another 5 and says, "Master, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. Well done, my good and faithful servant. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness." Likewise, the one with 2 bags of gold comes and says, "You gave me 2, I got you 2 more." And again, this person is affirmed, "Come and share in your master's happiness." Then the one who had received 1 bag of gold says, "Master, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you." And the master replies, "You wicked, lazy servant." Lazy is a crazy word here. "So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. And whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. God is a God who grows things. He harvests where he has not sown seed. Jesus takes a few loaves and he multiplies them and creates a miracle where he can feed 4,000 or 5,000. Unless the Lord builds the house, the laborer labors in vain, but the laborer still labors along with the Lord, knowing that the master here brings about more than what logic would dictate, that there's a high standard. And so we invest, we bring what was entrusted to us, we do our part, but we always have this idea that we're serving and working for the King, who is wanting to bring about many things, can bring about many things. So when Bud, this is the Bud Lindstrom Sunday, but I was talking to Bud this week. And Bud, if you know Bud, his leadership question is, where are we going, right? What are we doing? And it's a real simple one for me. When a group of people come together and begin to work very closely in an organized way, and when we're on the same page, running the same play, and when we're all living with expectancy that God can do more than all we ask or imagine, then we're beginning to look at the future and go, we don't even know what it might look like, but God is going to harvest where he has not sown seed. God is going to build a building beyond what we could build. God is going to feed more people than what we think we could feed. God is going to make a bigger difference in the Middle East than we think we can make. God is going to make a bigger impact in the greater Portland area than we think we can make. God is going to somehow take the little that we've got and work with it. Right? Where are we going? We're going somewhere big with expectancy as we invest what we have. The crazy thing is, to Bud's consternation, is I can't draw that all the way out for you. Because this is not a business where I get to be the architect of the final plan. This is a church where I'm called to shepherd and to lead people as we follow the pillar of fire and the cloud, because God ultimately is the one that directs. Jesus is the head of this body. So only as Jesus reveals the plans do we then follow. But this is the kind of parable here that we're to invest. So the parable of the stewards is this whole idea of whatever God gives you, invest it. And get a return on that. And if you do that, God will come celebrate you and say, he who has will be given more. Come share in my happiness. There's a lot of people in the United States that look for happiness. The Bible actually talks about happiness. It usually just gives us a framework for it or a blueprint for getting it that's very different than the consumerism of the culture that we live in. So then we get to the sheep and the goats, which is, so the parable of the stewards, the idea is invest. The parable of the sheep and goats is one that we talked about a number of weeks ago that mirrors Isaiah 58. And the whole idea of this is that as we're giving to the poor or the vulnerable or the needy, whatever you do for the least of these, you do unto me. So I'm just going to jump right to the conclusion. The parable of the sheep and goats is really about this idea of when we invest in others, we actually give to Jesus. When we invest in others, whatever you do for the least of these, you do unto me. When we invest into others, you give to Jesus. So it's a really interesting thing, taken together, one to the next of these parables. If we want to put it on the screen, it's three very interesting calls to action. It's that we're to be ready for the return of Jesus. That when he comes, we better be found ready. And that being ready looks like investing what he's given us. And investing actually looks like giving to others, which is a form of giving to Jesus. That we're to be ready, that we're to be ready by investing, that he's given us stuff that we're supposed to put in play in this world, that we're supposed to work and to labor, to serve. We are God's workmanship, that we were created before time to work out his purposes in our life. God foreknew us and created us with a plan and a purpose to do something in this world. Not just to experience God, not just to have spiritual feelings, but to co-labor with God in the Missio Dei, or the mission of God in this world. So be ready, invest, and that when you invest in others, you're giving to Jesus. That's a pretty amazing thing, but if we zoom out even further, I think it gets even more interesting. And zooming out further means that we realize there's a parable before the parable of the 10 virgins at the end of Matthew chapter 24. It's the parable of the stewards. And so when Matthew wrote his gospel, he did not put in chapter breaks. The chapter breaks are something that were put in, and the verse breaks were something that were put in by publishers along the history of the Bible as it's being carried forward. But Matthew just wrote it, would have written it on a scroll, most likely, and would have just written it in story form. So Matthew wasn't intending for there to be 3 parables back to back, but actually 4. And so what is the parable of the stewards? The parable of the stewards really is this idea that you're to keep watch, that the steward leaves the home, leaves the home and leaves people behind, and some of them in this household use that as an excuse to go do what they want to do. It's like the book of Judges. Everyone can do what is right in their own eyes. And they use it as an opportunity to just go and call their own shots. But there are some that are faithful and wise, and when the master comes home, he finds them doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so the key word here is keep watch. And the ones that do not keep watch, he will cut to pieces and assign them a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so in Dante's version of hell, you've got a place for the hypocrites. And so just think of that, the people that know what they ought to be doing, but don't actually do it. See, there's knowledge, but there's not action. It's kind of like James. Don't just be hearers of the word, be doers of the word. So there's this crazy thing that's being pointed out in this parable of the disconnect of knowing what you've been charged with and whether or not you actually fulfill that charge. So the key word here is, with the parable of the stewards, is to keep watch. So we're to keep watch, and keeping watch means that we're going to be ready, and being ready means that we're going to invest what is left to us or given to us according to our ability. And investing is going to look like loving on other people, which is a form of actually serving Jesus himself. And if we zoom out even more, and maybe I can draw this, if I'm lucky I can draw this. If we zoom out a little bit more, all of this is coming off of the beginning of Matthew 24, where Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple. If you tear this thing down, I'll build it again in 3 days. And then he talks about his return. And so the disciples go, how will we know what that time is? And Jesus starts by saying the world will be evangelized. The gospel will go out to all the nations. So you see Jesus talking about this prophecy of the temple, and then he gives us our missions mandate. John Jordan is as you know, is very particular about investing villages' resources into unreached people groups, that we have a priority of taking the gospel to places where it's not saturated already. As a part of getting the good news out, if nobody brings the good news, how are people going to hear it? Remember Romans, where Paul talks about that. So blessed are the feet of the one that carries that good news. Does that make sense? So we get this missions mandate, and then Jesus says, and then crazy things are going to happen, and so you need to be ready. Keep watch. Be ready. Invest. and that investment looks a lot like sacrificial love. I've been using the word justice. I don't care if you find a different word to use. Justice is just the best one that I've found. They've now both invited each other into each other's homes, and that this is this amazing thing to celebrate. He's doing reconciling work, justice work, as a part of missions. And then we see, as it moves from Matthew 25 into Matthew 26, that Jesus is anointed by Mary. This is where my daughter, Mary Joy, gets her name from. And so Jesus is anointed, and then Jesus goes to the Lord's Supper, and he appropriates the language of the Passover. And the Passover is reminding us that God is the one that liberates us. He's liberated us out of Egypt, even though we were oppressed. And we are reminded of what God did there. And in that call in the Old Testament, that reminder of taking the Passover meal, it was also a reminder, as we've learned the last 2 weeks with Kent Annan and Pastor Paul, it was a reminder that we were strangers once too. We were foreigners once too. Therefore, as we rehearse this story, we become the stories we tell. As we rehearse these stories, it shapes the way that we view foreigners or strangers. Does that make sense? And so Jesus now comes and takes all of what is embedded in the Passover, and he appropriates it and says, I'm now forgiving, dying on the cross for atonement for everyone. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. Now that everyone can have access. That's the message we take with our missionaries, isn't it? That's the message that YFC has taken in Lebanon, isn't it? And so this whole story begins with Jesus basically rolling us through, I have my last words for you. That I'm going to die, which is tantamount to this temple being torn down. Not the physical one, but that's what he was using as the symbolism. And the temple is going to be built again in 3 days. So you used to go there to meet God. Now you're going to meet God through me. Beautiful language. And he says, and then I'm going to leave, but I'm going to come back. And so I'm giving you final instructions to keep watch, Village Church, to be ready, Village Church, for the return of the Lord, that we get to invest whatever we have, whether it's a little or whether it's a lot, and that our investment is in people, in God's creation, in being sacrificial, in loving others the way we would want them to love us, and knowing that when we do that, we get to sense the smile of satisfaction that we are being good stewards. Well done, my faithful servant, right? That when we invest in others, it's actually giving to Jesus. And then Jesus is going to come back and go, this is all going to culminate into this rich symbolism of the Lord's Supper, which is for you, this picture now of finding yourself in this story, and a reminder for you each time you do this, each time you gather as an ecclesia, that I am coming back again, and that you can be looking to that day and encourage one another as the church unto that end. Isn't that beautiful? And so in just a minute, we're going to move into our communion. And then later in the service, we're going to give a grace offering. That even when we're trying to make things like year-end budgets and all that, we still take time once a month to say there's always enough multiplying of the loaves to take care of those in our community that need to be cared for. So I'm going to let Stan and the worship team come back up, and they're going to lead us in song, and then I'm going to return, and we're going to move toward communion this morning.